April 1945. The heart of Bavaria was a landscape of burning pine forests and the thick, suffocating smell of ozone from spent artillery shells. The Third Army was moving with a speed that defied military logistics, but General George S. Patton's mind was occupied by a specific, localized darkness that had nothing to do with tank maneuvers. Near the town of Hammelburg, units of the 14th Armored Division had just liberated a camp containing high-value prisoners, and among the captured Germans was a major from the Waffen-SS, a man whose reputation for cruelty was matched only by a secret that his own subordinates whispered about in the shadows of the barracks. This officer, Major Klaus von Richter, had a shameful preference for young recruits, a direct violation of the Nazis' own paragraph 175. Yet, in the twisted hierarchy of the Reich, he had been protected by his Knight's Cross and his fanatical loyalty to the party. When Patton's jeep screeched to a halt outside the interrogation center, he didn't find a broken soldier. He found an arrogant aristocrat who believed his rank still made him untouchable. Patton didn't just want a confession about war crimes. He wanted to dismantle the myth of the SS Superman by exposing the absolute hypocrisy hidden beneath the silver death's head insignia. What happened in that small, lamplit room, away from the eyes of the press and the high command, would never appear in an official military court transcript. It was a confrontation that pushed the boundaries of interrogation and revealed Patton's deep-seated belief that a man who betrays the trust of his own young soldiers cannot be trusted with the fate of a nation. Today, we go inside the room where the most feared general in the West met a monster wearing a hero's medals. This wasn't just an arrest. It was a psychological execution of the Nazi ego. This is the story of Patton's private war against the untouchables. To truly understand General Patton's cold, calculating fury, one must look into the specific, suffocating atmosphere of April 1945. The German front was collapsing into a chaos of white flags and mass surrenders, but the fanaticism within the Waffen-SS was reaching a desperate, final fever pitch. Major Klaus von Richter was more than just a commandant. He was a veteran of the horrific winter slaughter on the Eastern Front. He had been decorated by Hitler himself, and he carried the cold arrogance of the Prussian military caste. But von Richter's heroism was a mask. Under his command were boys of the Hitler Youth and the Volkssturm, teenagers as young as 14 who were being forced to fight Patton's tanks with nothing but Panzerfausts and blind faith. For these boys, von Richter wasn't just a commander. He was a predator who used the absolute power of his rank to exploit them. In the Third Reich, the law was clear. Paragraph 175 of the German Criminal Code mandated that any man found with shameful preferences for other men be sent to a concentration camp or face execution. Yet, the SS elite often lived by a different set of rules. Richter believed that as long as he kept winning battles, his private crimes would remain hidden behind his medals. When the 14th Armored Division liberated the Hammelburg area, the American intelligence officers were stunned. They found young German POWs who were not weeping for their lost Reich, but were terrified at the mention of their own major's name. Patton arrived at the interrogation hut as a light, freezing rain began to fall. The temperature was a damp 4 degrees Celsius, and the air inside the interrogation room felt like a tomb, smelling of wet wool, stale tobacco, and the metallic scent of unwashed bodies. Richter stood at attention, his back straight as a spear, his silver SS runes glinting. He expected to be interrogated by a junior colonel. Instead, the door slammed open, and General George S. Patton stepped into the dim light. Patton didn't offer the usual military courtesies. He stood by the window for a long minute, watching the rain wash the blood and mud off a nearby Sherman tank. Finally, he turned, his ivory-handled revolvers visible under his coat, and his voice was a low, lethal rasp that made the guards outside shiver. "I've spent 40 years studying the profession of arms, Richter. I've seen killers, I've seen thieves, and I've seen cowards. But you are something else. You are a parasite wearing a hero's coat." The interrogation was not a search for troop movements or fuel depot locations. Patton already had his scouts for that. This was a clinical, 4-hour deconstruction of a monster's soul. Patton sat across from Richter, the dim yellow light of a single bulb casting long, jagged shadows across the room. He didn't use physical force. He didn't need to. Patton knew that for a man like Richter, who believed in the inherent superiority of his blood, the ultimate weapon was a mirror held up to his own hypocrisy. Patton reached into his leather map case and pulled out a stack of handwritten testimonies. These were the statements of the teenagers Richter had abused, boys who had been told they were fighting for the future of Europe, only to find their greatest enemy was their own commander. Patton began to read them aloud, his voice steady and rhythmic, like a judge pronouncing a final sentence. With each sentence, the mask of the Prussian officer began to slip. Richter's hands, encased in gray leather gloves, began to tremble. Patton mocked him. He quoted the SS manual on discipline and then pointed to the major's medals. "You wear the Knight's Cross," Patton spat. "A medal given for bravery? Tell me, Major, does it feel heavy? Or is it light as air, because you know it was bought with the silence of children?" Patton wasn't just interrogating a man. He was burning down the house of cards that was the Nazi ideology. Then came the moment that destroyed Richter's spirit. Patton ordered the MPs to bring in the major's former soldiers, 3 boys who looked like they should be in a classroom, not a war zone. Patton forced Richter to stand and face them. The room was silent, except for the heavy breathing of the terrified boys. Patton leaned in close to Richter, so close the major could smell the general's tobacco and the cold air of the front. "In my army, a general's first duty is to keep his men alive. Your first duty was to destroy them. You are a traitor to the very uniform you're wearing." In a move that shocked everyone in the room, Patton didn't call for a court-martial right then. He ordered the MPs to strip the major of his rank and his medals on the spot. He didn't just take them. He dropped the silver runes into a bucket of dirty water used for mopping the floor. "You aren't a war criminal, Richter. A war criminal is a soldier who went too far in the heat of battle. You're just a common predator who hid behind a flag. You are stripped of your rank, not by the laws of America, but by the laws of common decency." This wasn't just a humiliation. It was the psychological erasure of a man's identity. Patton understood that social death was far more terrifying than a firing squad. Some of Patton's peers viewed his involvement in the Richter case as a distraction from the race to the Danube. But Patton was playing a deeper game. He understood that the Nazi regime was built on a facade of moral and physical superiority. By exposing Richter as a predator, Patton was destroying the SS legend at its core. He knew that the news of an SS hero being stripped of his rank for exploiting his own boys would spread through the POW camps faster than any Allied propaganda. In his private diary that evening, Patton wrote, "The German mind is a strange mechanism. It cannot survive the realization that its gods are frauds. Today, I didn't just break a man, I broke a myth." This was Patton's denazification by disillusionment. He realized that to kill the Nazi ideology, he had to show the world that its leaders were not monsters to be feared, but pathetic men to be despised. He was looking beyond the war, ensuring that when the guns fell silent, no martyrs would remain for the Nazi cause. This wasn't just a distraction. It was a surgical strike on the enemy's will to resist. Major Klaus von Richter was never granted the honor of a soldier's exit. Patton ensured a much slower, more lingering fate. Richter was placed in a general POW enclosure with Wehrmacht infantrymen, the very men he had looked down upon. But the general made sure the other prisoners knew exactly why Richter had been stripped of his runes. In the brutal social hierarchy of the camps, Richter became a pariah, viewed as a stain on the collective survival of his comrades. He eventually vanished into the gray anonymity of the post-war German legal system. For the young boys under his command, this confrontation was a moment of liberation greater than the arrival of tanks. They saw a general who possessed a moral compass that refused to tolerate the corruption of the innocent. One of those boys later recalled that Patton's righteous anger was the spark that made him question a decade of Nazi propaganda. Patton proved that the most powerful weapon isn't a 75mm cannon. It is the courage to call a monster by its true name. This is the legacy he left behind. A justice that didn't just end a war, but began the healing of a continent's soul. Thank you for staying with us through this deep dive. If you believe the raw truth of history should never be sanitized, hit that subscribe button and join our community. Was Patton right to take a personal interest in this justice, or did he go too far? Let us know in the comments.